A week after Trump embraced Putin, the Ukraine peace effort is going nowhere. Political messages don't get much blunter than the Russian missiles that slammed into an American-owned manufacturing firm overnight Wednesday in western Ukraine, hundreds of miles away from the frontline trenches of a war with no end in sight. The attack, part of the most intense Russian drone and missile strikes on Ukraine in more than a month, punctuated Moscow's brick wall diplomacy, which is grinding President Donald Trump's peace effort to a halt. It's a week since Trump applauded Russian President Vladimir Putin down a red carpet in Alaska. The US president has orchestrated spectacles and statesman-like photo ops with European leaders, and the White House has proclaimed stunning breakthroughs. But the underlying realities of the war have barely changed. Russia is still bombing and droning Ukrainian civilians. It's erected new roadblocks to Trump's rush for a quick peace, contradicting US claims that it made concessions. What has been true in the 3.5 years since Russia's invasion is true now. Putin doesn't want to end the war. A summit between Ukrainian and Russian leaders, with Trump possibly on hand, that the administration predicted could come as soon as the end of this week remains a pipe dream. Russia's blocking maneuvers are led by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, a master of the obstructive arts of the Soviet Union, which he learned as a young diplomat before the Berlin Wall fell. On Thursday, Lavrov sought to reopen splits between the US and Europe that Putin pulled at in Alaska, condemning US allies. "I see many signs that this activity is aimed precisely at undermining the progress that began to clearly emerge as a summit in Alaska," Lavrov said. "The Russian strategy is clear. Delay the diplomacy for as long as possible in order to allow Putin's bloody and slogging military strategy to eke out frontline gains." Ukraine's reality hasn't changed either. President Volodymyr Zelensky is still trying to appease Trump by appearing open to whatever he suggests. At least he escaped his trip to the White House on Monday without another disastrous blow-up, but he still can't accept the poisoned peace Putin offers. Ceding to Russian demands for strategic land handovers in the critical Donbass region would set up Moscow for a new blitzkrieg on Kiev in future. It's not clear Trump gets this. Europe's top leaders staged an impressive show of unity at the White House on Monday. They desperately tried to peel away Trump from Putin after his flurry of concessions to the Russian leader. But Europe's plan for security guarantees for a post-war Ukraine looks as woolly as ever. And it can't happen without Trump. Any such plan would rest on two stipulations. One, that the UK and France, the leaders of the coalition of the willing, would, if it came to it, be ready to go to war with US help against Russia to defend Ukraine. And two, that Moscow would sign a peace deal that binds Western troops to Ukraine in a mutual defense arrangement. Both scenarios are fanciful. Still, Trump deserves credit for injecting energy into the peace effort. He's the only leader who can talk to both sides, and who has the power to summon a Russian president to the US and to convene allied leaders in Washington at the drop of a hat. And while Trump often tilts toward Putin rather than his Western allies, he hasn't forced Ukraine into the surrender many of his critics feared. His pressure on NATO allies to spend more on defense will help secure Europe's future. A genuine legacy achievement that could save thousands of lives in Ukraine is not out of the question for a president who craves respect and history's validation. And 1 week is also an absurdly short time to assess a peace effort. Peace drives in places such as Bosnia and Northern Ireland unfolded over months and years of complex diplomacy. But that attention to detail is exactly what Trump lacks. He and his envoy Steve Witkoff, a fellow real estate developer, speak offhandedly about Ukraine making land swaps, without apparently understanding the agonizing choices this would entail, which are rooted in national identity, and the blood spilled to defend key regions. And perennial questions about Trump are cropping up again. Why won't he impose the US pressure that might force an easing of Russia's hardline position? And why does he invest trust in a Russian leader whose actions deserve the opposite? Trump's faith in Putin was laid bare in a hot mic moment at the White House on Monday. "I think he wants to make a deal for me, you understand that, as crazy as it sounds," he told French President Emmanuel Macron. It's hard to take Trump's words at face value. Trump on Thursday seemed to betray frustration with the deadlock, in a cryptic social media post that hinted at support for Ukrainian strikes on Russian soil. "It is very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's sick country," he wrote. "It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense but is not allowed to play offense." But one lesson of the past week is that it's unwise to emphasize any single comment by the president. He's been all over the map. At one point Monday, for example, He seemed to hint at openness to U.S. troops serving in any post-war reassurance force in Ukraine. He quickly rode back after uproar on MAGA media. A week after he met with Putin, however, Trump's reputation and the strongman image he incessantly cultivates are primed for embarrassment. He was played, again. This undercuts the core rationale of his presidency, that he's the world's greatest dealmaker. It's one thing to beat up on smaller nations with tariffs and to browbeat Europeans who rely on the US for defense. But Trump's meeting with Putin and his failure to get the better of China's leader Xi Jinping in a trade war suggests that the real hard men scoff at his art of the deal mythology. Before he took toughened sanctions against Russia off the table, the very threat that probably lured Putin to Alaska, Trump complained that Putin was ready to talk peace, but then sent a murderous volley of missiles into Ukraine. It's happening again. Russia overnight Wednesday killed 9 civilians as 574 strike drones and 40 missiles targeted Ukraine, including as far west as the city of Lviv near the Polish border. And 19 people were injured in a strike against a US-owned manufacturing firm Flex Limited in the western region of Zakarpattia. Coming from a nation as attuned to symbolism as Putin's Russia, this is unlikely to have been a coincidence. The Russians knew exactly where they were hitting, Zelensky said in his nightly video address Thursday. We believe that this was a deliberate strike against American property here in Ukraine, against American investments. The White House's spin this week seems designed to cover up the lack of progress. It's very important to remember that before President Trump's landslide victory last November, there was no end in sight to this bloodshed, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said on Wednesday. Now there may finally be light at the end of the tunnel and an opportunity for lasting peace. That's because President Trump is the peace president. Leavitt slammed experts who questioned Trump's approach and accused journalists of sabotaging the process to hurt him. A failure to objectively assess the impediments to Trump's peace process is one reason why it risks collapsing. There is also the president's willingness to concede to Putin's positions without extracting flexibility in return, as well as the administration's repeated failure to accurately interpret Russian positions. One area where there has been progress is in the president's openness to act as a backup to a European security guarantee for Ukraine after the war, which could see US pilots flying air support missions. Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a call on the issue Thursday with European national security advisors. Rubio, who also serves as US National Security Advisor, told his counterparts that the US was willing to play a limited role, but that Europe should take the lead, according to a European diplomat on the call. Trump's shift stances to match Putin's. Trump went into the summit a week ago bullishly predicting he'd forge the ceasefire that Ukraine and Europe say must be a precursor to serious diplomacy. But after a few hours with Putin, he'd changed his mind, reasoning that a push for a full, final peace deal was better. That just happens to be Russia's view too. Over the weekend, Witkoff insisted on CNN's State of the Union that Putin had signed off on robust security guarantees for Ukraine as part of any final deal. Anyone with knowledge of recent history knew that sounded fishy. And so it proved, with Lavrov confirming Moscow is sticking to its long-time stance that it should be one of the guarantors. A risible suggestion following the invasion, but one that seeks to cement Putin's aim of making Ukraine a vassal state. Trump was on Monday speaking confidently about a meeting between Zelensky and Putin by the end of this week. And he said he'd probably join in. But now he's adopted Russia's line that a two-way Zelensky-Putin meeting is best. This would be risky for Ukraine. It's likely the Russian leader would use Trump's absence to portray Zelensky as intractable, and to blame for stalling peace. And that's if Putin showed up. He's made clear he views Zelensky as an illegitimate leader, and that he doesn't see Ukraine as an independent state. In any case, Lavrov is playing for time. On Thursday, he proposed a laborious sequence of conversations between expert ministers and appropriate recommendations to consider a summit. One realistic view of where things stand. Not everything that happens in a diplomatic process happens publicly. So despite the unpromising atmosphere, diligent behind-the-scenes work and pressure could begin to narrow some gaps. But a week after Alaska, Putin is showing he wants to fight on. Zelensky cannot fold, and Europe can't make peace on its own. It's up to Trump. Will he toughen up and throw himself into the details to forge a genuine peace process? The most accurate current diagnosis of the tortuous path ahead is that offered last Sunday by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, one Trump aide not sugarcoating the situation. We're still a long ways off, Rubio told ABC. I mean, we're not at the precipice of a peace agreement. We're not at the edge of one. White House signals strong momentum toward peace in Ukraine, but many questions linger. President Donald Trump's foreign envoy Steve Witkoff, one of 3 American participants in Friday's summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin, described on Sunday several major agreements reached during the Alaska talks that he said created strong momentum toward a peace agreement with Ukraine. Witkoff told CNN that Putin had signed off on allowing, quote, security guarantees as part of an eventual peace accord, including a provision that would provide for a collective defense of Ukraine by the United States and Europe, should Russia attempt another invasion. We agreed to robust security guarantees that I would describe as game-changing, Witkoff told Jake Tapper on State of the Union, adding the Russians had also pledged legislative enshrinement of a promise not to invade Ukraine or another European country in any forthcoming peace plan. Neither provision has been mentioned in Russian accounts of the summit. Witkoff's public description of Friday's summit was the most fulsome yet of what was discussed for nearly 3 hours behind closed doors in Anchorage. Trump will meet Monday at the White House with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and several European leaders to discuss the matter in more detail. Still, many questions remained about how the U.S. is assessing Putin's seriousness about reaching a deal, whether his promises can be trusted after a track record of violating previous peace agreements, and what exactly Trump is willing to offer to ensure Ukraine isn't invaded again. Heading into Friday's meeting, Trump said he would be disappointed if a ceasefire wasn't reached and threatened severe consequences on Russia if Putin didn't end the fighting. But as he departed, Trump said he was no longer aiming for an immediate ceasefire, and declared, "We don't have to think about sanctions after the talks." Witkoff said, significant progress during the summit led Trump to abandon his push for an immediate ceasefire, and instead work toward advancing a larger peace agreement. "We made so much progress at this meeting with regard to all the other ingredients necessary for a peace deal, that President Trump pivoted to that place," Witkoff said. The other U.S. participant in the talks, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, offered a more guarded assessment of how close a peace agreement may be. "We made progress in the sense that we identified potential areas of agreement, but there remain some big areas of disagreement. So we're still a long ways off," he said on ABC's This Week. "We're not at the precipice of a peace agreement, we're not at the edge of one, but I do think progress was made." He said later on CBS, Face the Nation, that any agreement to end the war would cause disappointment on both sides. "It may not be pleasant, it may be distasteful, but in order for there to be an end to the war, there are things that Russia wants that it cannot get, and there are things that Ukraine wants that it's not going to get," he said. The agreements Witkoff described will be at the center of meetings Monday between Trump and Zelensky. A large delegation of European officials, including the leaders of France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Finland, the European Union and NATO, will accompany the Ukrainian leader for the talks. Trump on Sunday night previewed the message he'll deliver to his White House visitors. Zelensky must agree to some of Russia's conditions for the war in Ukraine to end. President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately, if he wants to, or he can continue to fight. Trump wrote on social media, "Remember how it started. No getting back Obama given Crimea, 12 years ago without a shot being fired. And no going into NATO by Ukraine." The post underscored the pressure Zelensky will face Monday as Trump works to end the conflict. The 2 conditions he listed, that Ukraine cede Crimea, which Russia illegally annexed in 2014, and that it agree never to join NATO, are among the conditions Putin has set for ending the war. European leaders have been pressing Trump to follow through on his threat of tough new economic penalties on Russia, but Rubio cautioned such steps could scuttle progress on a peace deal. "The minute he takes those steps, all talks stop," he said. "The minute we take those steps, there is no one left in the world to go talk to the Russians and try to get them to the table to reach a peace agreement." A breakout session during Monday's talks at the White House will explore options for security guarantees for Ukraine that would ensure Russia is unable to reinvade the country once a peace deal is in place. Zelensky and European leaders have said such assurances are necessary as part of a peace accord. Witkoff said the clause agreed to by Russia, akin to NATO's Article 5 agreement that an attack against one country is an attack against all, was a workaround for Russia's insistence Ukraine never be able to join NATO. He described it as the first time we had ever heard the Russians agree to such a provision being included in a peace deal. What the United States would contribute to the effort versus the Europeans remained unclear. Trump has previously stated clearly that American troops won't be on the ground in Ukraine, and has said the onus is on European nations to take the lead in protecting it. Some officials believe a robust security infrastructure for Ukraine could make it easier for Zelensky to accept some of Russia's demands for land concessions as part of a peace deal. Putin has not abandoned some of his maximalist ideas, including that Ukraine give up the entire eastern Donbas region, where Russia currently occupies large swathes of territory. But Witkoff said Putin did make some concessions on his land requirements, suggested the Russians now see land swapping occurring at the current front lines of the war rather than the administrative boundaries of at least some of the 5 regions long in Putin's sights. The Russians made some concessions at the table with regard to all 5 of those regions. He said, adding the issue would be discussed with Zelensky on Monday and, quote, hopefully we can cut through and make some decisions right then and there.